Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Lyon, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine into our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. The National Academies provide independent, objective advice to inform policy with evidence, spark progress and innovation, and confront challenging issues for the benefit of society. In keeping with this mission, we're excited to host these conversations about issues relevant to policy action on climate change. I'd like to acknowledge that the National Academy's Washington, D.C. headquarters are physically housed on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan and Piscataway peoples past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have been its stewards throughout the generations. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. We acknowledge that the expertise held by different Indigenous communities is crucial to the work of understanding and addressing climate change. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you'd like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the dedicated question and answer period in the final hour. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. Above, you'll also see a sign up for our weekly newsletter about upcoming climate activities at the academies. For today's climate conversation, we'll take a closer look at the benefits and challenges presented by offshore wind. I'm grateful to be joined by Susan Phillips, who will be moderating the event. Susan is a founding member of the award-winning State Impact Pennsylvania website and reporter for WHYY since 2004, covering politics, immigration, and criminal justice. In 2013, she won the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Journalism Award for her fracking coverage and the Associated Press Sandy Starbin Award for her investigative reports on the impact to rural drinking water related to gas drilling. She has received 10 Edward R. Murrow Awards and spent a year at MIT studying climate change as a Knight Science Journalism Fellow. Susan, over to you.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. So offshore wind power has the potential to increase the amount of renewable energy in our race to decarbonize and stave off the worst impacts of climate change. This is important because the world is way behind on its agreed upon goals to reduce carbon emissions caused primarily by burning fossil fuels. Climate change impacts are here, and I can just tell you, reporting on this topic has forced me to change my focus a bit this year from explanatory and investigative pieces to breaking news, as we had to cover impacts of Canadian wildfire smoke, deadly flooding, and a school season delayed by a week because of such high temperatures. Offshore wind farms are ideally located closer to coastal population centers because it cuts down on the amount of infrastructure needed to transmit power. But the marine setting also increases operation and maintenance costs, which have a variety of concerns, has created a lot of debate. So today we have two expert guests who will help us navigate these issues and talk about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for offshore wind and its role in decarbonizing our energy consumption. We'll discuss how offshore wind projects are developed, what the current economic and policy landscape for implementing the technology is now, and for future projects as well. So I'm thrilled to introduce our two guests who will help us unpack this complex topic. Josh Kohut is currently a professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences and a member of the Center for Ocean Observing Leadership at Rutgers University. Using networks of ocean observing technologies, his research and extension programs focus on the ocean processes that structure marine ecosystems. He's involved in many research programs that range in scope from storm intensity, offshore wind, and local water quality monitoring off the Jersey coast, regional fisheries along the U.S. East Coast, and environmental studies of polar ecosystems in the coastal waters surrounding Antarctica. So lots of experience there. Tricia Yaley is an attorney and environmental leader. She's the offshore wind policy manager for the Nature Conservancy. In this role, Tricia coordinates and leads the Conservancy's offshore wind energy efforts. Before joining the Nature Conservancy, Tricia served as the chief of the Environment and Energy Unit of the Rhode Island Attorney General's Office. From 2009 to 2016, she served as vice president and Rhode Island director of the Conservation Law Foundation, where she worked closely with federal and state agencies in developing the Rhode Island Ocean Special Area Management Plan. And that was the first federally approved ocean plan for offshore wind in the US. Tricia has also represented the commercial fishing community in negotiations related to compensatory mitigation for planned offshore wind projects off the coast of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So as you can see, lots of expertise we have for you today. Let's start with Tricia. Can you tell us what brought you into the space? How did you get involved in offshore wind?
Sure, and you alluded to it a little bit. I'm from Rhode Island, so I've worked in and from Rhode Island for the entirety of my career. And starting around the year 2009, my job as an environmental attorney for the state, and then later as an environmental advocate for a nonprofit, brought me into many of the legal and policy rooms where the future of offshore wind was being decided, and where early federal process for offshore wind was being shaped. So as many may already know, Rhode Island is home to the nation's first commercial offshore wind project, which was sited in state waters off the coast of Block Island. And through its coastal zone management agency, Rhode Island created the first of its kind Ocean Special Area Management Plan under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. I was very involved in the creation of that plan and the stakeholder process, and remain involved in the different aspects of offshore wind as it continued to move forward in the state and then at the federal level.
Gotcha. Okay. And I've been to that. I've been to the Rhode Island offshore wind farm. It's a pretty amazing place if you get a chance to go.
It's behind me.
Yes, I see that.
Yes.
So Josh, how about you? How did you get into researching offshore wind impacts?
Yeah, so for over 3 decades, our group has been involved in studying the coastal ocean and the different processes that happen in the coastal ocean. And so when you think about offshore wind and its deployment, it's in that coastal ocean environment. And so trying to understand how we can bring the current knowledge of that system to decision making related to offshore wind, and also what are the new research questions that are coming up, and how can we apply our experience and also the different technologies that we use to just better understand that environment. And I know we're going to talk more about that as we go on in this, but it's really just, it's a fascinating place, and it happens to be co-located with offshore wind projects.
And on that note, if you could, Tricia, if you could talk about why so much of this development right now is focused on the East Coast.
Sure. I think there are a few reasons. One, we know from wind studies that the winds off the Atlantic coast are stronger, really, than any other place in the world. And interestingly enough, they happen to be strongest in the winter, when our high energy demand centers will need this energy most for home heating. But I think, and you kind of touched on this in your opening as well, Susan, that we're also incredibly densely populated along the Atlantic coast, and we just don't have the space for the kind of terrestrial renewable energy deployment that we're going to need to meet our decarbonization targets. And I think that kind of dovetails into the fact that the states along the Atlantic coast do in fact have very aggressive decarbonization, climate goals, electrification goals that are kind of feeding into this demand for offshore wind in this place.
And Josh, I mean, you've obviously been a researcher long before these offshore wind projects have been proposed, but tell me how you've seen this offshore wind generation. How has it evolved over the past decade?
Well, in the areas immediate off of our coast in the mid-Atlantic, it's evolved quite a bit from discussions of how this technology might be deployed, understanding what the wind resource is locally in the areas of some of these, recognizing the things that Tricia mentioned and you have mentioned about the reason why the Atlantic coast is such a favorite place. The other factor that's important on the oceanographic side is there's a broad continental shelf. And what that simply means is that there's relatively shallow water that extends quite a bit further from the coasts in the Atlantic coast of the US compared to other parts of the coastal regions. And so what we've seen is a recognition of the resource, the basically the background conditions that are advantageous for setting up offshore wind. And over those times, there's also been a discussion, right? The ocean is not empty offshore, right? There are constant factors that are changing the environment out there. There are other users of the ocean. And so the evolution has been to see how all those different communities can engage. And so decision making could be made so that we can have a sustainable offshore wind industry off the Atlantic coast.
Great. And I'm wondering, Tricia, if you could speak to this, a similar question, but from your particular expertise, right, in terms of how it's evolved just from a policy or development aspect.
Sure. And I think, again, these really intersect the things that Josh is talking about and the policy, right? So the 15 years ago, the United States and the states were really just trying to sort out their respective regulatory roles. They were trying to figure out the best way to do ocean use planning, the best way to identify and engage who the users were, who the stakeholders were, how to engage them, how to inventory important habitat areas, kind of inventory the data we have or the missing data, how to prioritize that. And so there's that whole kind of science-oriented environmental review regulatory bucket that has been evolving since we started quite significantly. But then there's also the role of the states and how we buy energy. And states were just starting to try to figure out how to buy offshore wind energy. And they were having to think through what kind of process do they need? What kind of expertise and capacity don't they have that they're going to need? And we were really, at the beginning, taking regulatory frameworks that at a federal level had been designed for oil and gas leasing and applying them as frameworks for offshore wind. And a great deal has changed since then. So we've talked a bit about how the state's renewable energy and electrification goals have really progressed over time. So like, for example, and I think this is important to understand, if we're just looking at like New York, they require enough renewable energy to serve 70% of their load by 2030 and to have zero emissions in 2040 associated with their electrical demand. So once these mandates started to get established at the state level, the states really had to figure out how to achieve them. And they hired consultants, they prepared decarbonization strategies, and most of those decarbonization strategies were saying, you aren't going to do this without offshore wind. So that's really why you see, the state goals really outpacing the federal goals, and why we are kind of watching this whole process between the way the roles of the federal government and the roles of the state government evolve as they learn. And I think it has been really iterative, which is a good thing for the most part.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that it was based on oil and gas, and yet it has to evolve into its own sort of framework, right? And I'm just wondering, we recently, today, right before we started this seminar, New York announced, or Ørsted announced that they're going to be developing another project off the New York coast. Although back in October, I think it was Halloween, Ørsted pulled out of New Jersey, and that was a big shock to a lot of people. How did you see that? Did that change how the states and the federal governments or any of the regulatory bodies look at these projects?
I think it did. We're starting to see a couple of things happen there. So states typically have been using competitive bidding process for some kind of fixed contract instrument. They either use a power purchase agreement or what are known as offshore renewable energy certificates. Until recently, until this started happening, these contracts didn't include any kind of mechanism to go back in and adjust the price for inflation for length of time. And we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but you know, the Vineyard Wind Project, which just began construction, began the environmental review and siting process about a decade ago. That's a really long time frame to be locked in at a price and then have all those things happen with supply chain, global supply chain, the market, you know, the commodity, kind of the commodity price risk and the exposure of that generator's kind of financial performance to those fluctuations in the market really made the contracts not viable. And so what we've been seeing is many of the states now in these next rounds are adding in language that allows them to have some flexibility, some indexing mechanisms that allow for a fixed point in time to consider a readjustment of the price after some point in the environmental review process has passed, for example.
Right, exactly. And I know New Jersey has done that as well. So I mean, I think we want to take a little deeper dive into the issues now. I mean, we sort of got a lay of the land. There are issues. It seems like that offshore wind is very nascent, right? It's just, at least in the US, and how it interacts in terms of, you know, what the environmental impacts are and what the, you know, policy and regulatory frameworks are. But I want to like take a little bit of a deeper dive now in this next section, but I want to ask you, Josh, to talk to us about like what are some of the current challenges to offshore wind development from your perspective, from the environmental you know, perspective of putting these industrial structures in an ocean.
Yeah, so that's it, right? There are technical challenges just with doing that, right? Constructing things in the ocean is hard. But the other thing is that the ocean moves, right? And we have a lot of proof of that, right? We've been collecting data in the ocean for hundreds of years in this area. And what you see is a very dynamic environment that we're trying to plan multi-decadal projects in that are static in that space. And we talked about some of the other users. They're responding to not only an ocean that changes frequently, but also the ecology that's in it, whether it's fisheries, marine mammals, phytoplankton or zooplankton, they're all responding to that moving ocean. And so the challenge is, how can we take our understanding of that dynamic ocean and incorporate that into smart decision making and policies around installing a facility offshore. And so our activity has been focused on really trying to bring our knowledge of that dynamic ocean, interfacing with the different users, interfacing with the policymakers to think about, and the decision makers to think about, well, what's a time scale that makes sense? We know, right? Me as an oceanographer, I'll tell you, well, the ocean changes every hour. Some oceanographers look at how it changes every millisecond, right? But that's not a realistic time scale to incorporate into decision making and policy making. So how do we work together to do that? But that's one of the inherent challenges is we have to think about that in the context of how the ocean changes from season to season, what the effect of climate change is on the system, right? We're seeing shifts in fisheries. We're seeing different responses from different organisms in the ocean to changes that are occurring over decades, to changes that occur when a storm passes through. So in my view, that's the challenge, is how do we plan for something that's static in an environment that just inherently moves.
And has there been anything in your research on this that sort of surprised you, or that you think would inform how offshore wind is developed?
Oh, I think there are. I think there are, and that's where the collaboration comes in. You know, kind of tying back to one of your earlier questions, like the way this has all evolved. One of the really exciting things that I'm seeing is there are far more collaborative research projects that are going on. And by collaborative, I don't mean just number of people, but the different experiences of people that are represented, not just the professional scientist, but those that work in that space, whether it's a commercial fisher, recreational fisher, or whoever it might be, to try and understand like what scales of variability matter to a decision-making process. How do we isolate the effects when we think about mitigation of impacts and things like that? How do we actually attribute an effect to a particular project when we know that the ocean is always changing, right? And so I think the part that surprises, it's not a surprise, but it's a pleasant change, is that we're having far more collaborative work that's being done. And the discussions that we're having are, what is the appropriate scale? I do think there is an appropriate scale, and there's a way to find that balance between trying to plan for something in a 30-year time frame, but have that plan account for and have the flexibility to respond to changes that we're seeing on shorter timescales.
Gotcha. And of course, you know, you're also having to, I'm sure, like incorporate changes due to climate change in all of this, you know.
That's right. Yeah, changes to climate change, changes to, you know, if we have a warm winter compared to a cold winter, how does the system respond to that? Well, that can happen. You know, last year we had no snow. This year we're having some snow. Well, that actually has an effect on the coastal ocean when we think about how much fresh water is going in. So these are things that we need to incorporate. And the good thing is we have a long history as a community of researching this, and we have some knowledge on what the effects of climate are on the system, of what the effects of these different changes from season to season are on the system.
Okay. So, Tricia, from your perspective, and I know you touched on this a bit already, but I'm just wondering if there's a way for you to sort of it does at least from a reporter's perspective, trying to report on this, it gets so complicated as to like who decides what, you know. You got federal government, state government, you've got state utility commissions, you've got you know, so many different hands in this pot. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of break that down for us, if that's possible,
Sure.
in a
I'll do my
digestible
best.
way.
I have, so, you know, Josh is really talking about the science and ecological complexities, and add to that the regulatory and economic complexities, market complexities. And we know that this is a really challenging task. So we've talked a bit about the state roles. The states act as buyers for energy. They also have authority under the Coastal Zone Management Act to exercise review over projects that are taking place in federal waters, if they can demonstrate that those projects will have a reasonably foreseeable effect on the coastal policies of the state. And many of the states are doing that, and they're working with developers and the federal government in that context. The federal government, this is, I think, where it gets really complex. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management operates under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. They are in charge of leasing and management of the Outer Continental Shelf, which extends 3 nautical miles from the coast out to the exclusive economic zone, which is about 200 miles off the coast. And they really act kind of primarily as a landlord. I mean, they are a leasing agent for the seabed of the Outer Continental Shelf. And they have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, and they have to consult with other agencies that have regulatory responsibilities over different aspects of things in the ocean. And that can be, we're talking military, we're talking the Coast Guard, we're talking protected species, endangered and threatened species, fish habitat, essential fish habitat, commercially and recreationally important fish species, migratory birds, right? So it extends all to all these different sectors and all these different agencies that have to be consulted. But I like to use this example, I guess, when thinking about the complexity here for from the developer's perspective. So consider that in the Netherlands, when a company bids in response to a government tender to build a project, that winning bidder acquires all of the permits. It has an energy buyer and it has a pathway to connect that project to the grid. In the United States, none of those guarantees exist. When a company bids to acquire a lease, they have acquired a lease, usually at a significant price. It has no corresponding right to build an offshore wind project. The developer has to do all of the site assessment and all of the site characterization work within that lease area to determine what kind of foundations are possible, the scope of and scale of the project size. They need to comply with all of the mitigation requirements from all of the federal agencies relative to their site assessment activities. And then they need to prepare a construction and operation plan, which has to go through another round of environmental review, where they have to comply with the mitigation required and kind of justify their design. So they have to secure approximately, I think it's close to 60 state and federal permits and sometimes local permits through a multiple year environmental review process. They have to secure a contract to sell their energy to an adjacent state or utility. And they have to identify the path to connect the project to the grid. And often as the generator, they have the sole responsibility for paying for the upgrades to the grid that are necessary to support the interconnection of their project. So from beginning to end, I think I mentioned it took Vineyard Wind about 10 years just to go through the environmental review process. Even with some improvements to that process, it's still taking about 6 years. And so the developers have to understand all of those federal legal regulatory complexities. They have to understand the differences between the adjacent states in the buying procedures, and they have to be capable of responding to all of the mitigation requirements before they can proceed with construction of a project.
It's a lot, yes.
It's a lot.
And I mean, just to tag on to that, I mean, we also have heard a lot about one of the reasons in the case of Ørsted and others is this issue with supply chain. And when we hear that, what does that mean? Like, what are we talking about? What kind of supply chains are necessary to build these offshore wind farms?
So quite a bit. We're in competition with other countries in the world that are building at a faster pace and a larger scale than we are in the United States. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory produced kind of a report on how to get to 30 gigawatts by 2030 that was really focused on supply chain. I think they called it their supply chain roadmap. And they were talking about, the number of turbines, so the steel that we need, the foundations, the miles of cable, the crew transfer vessels, the wind turbine installation vessels, which is a very specific kind of vessel. There are currently only 3 of those in the world. And every project that is putting in monopiles is in a queue to get access to those wind turbine installation vessels. That's complicated by the fact that in the United States, we have the Jones Act, which has restrictions on foreign vessels moving between U.S. points and points in the outer continental shelf, and limit and constraints on what those vessels can do. So you need cable laying vessels, you need scour protection installation vessels, heavy lift vessels, those types of things. And you need a workforce to do this. You need a trained workforce to do it. So this is not a problem that is unique to the United States. We are seeing these challenges talked about in Europe and in the UK and in South Korea as they're trying to build out their workforces and their supply chains. But it is, I think, well, let me just say this. There's it's an unintentional disconnect, but we see some policies move forward, like Treasury guidance, for example, that provides incentives for certain types of foundation that based on domestic content versus other types of foundations based on domestic content. And there's different kind of restrictions that are built into the guidance there that kind of also help inform what the supply chain is looking to build. And to go back to kind of Josh's point on the ecological piece and impact piece, we need like the science to inform the types of decisions we make at the supply chain level, so that we're choosing the things that are better for the environment and we're incentivizing those things. And we really need to kind of get out of our silos as a nation in the way that we're thinking about how to stand up a supply chain and a workforce. Just have lots of agencies thinking about it from different perspectives: Coast Guard, Treasury, BOEM, environmental agencies, and we aren't really aligned in our approach to it, which I think is confusing for developers. It doesn't lend to predictability, and it certainly doesn't put us in a position to really be able to drive and improve environmental outcome from the choices we make associated with these technology selections.
Yeah, that's really important information. And one of the things before I wrap up this section, to segue off that, I am wondering how do we continue this kind of development, offshore wind development, while also being sensitive to both the ocean ecosystem and the fisheries, right? And I don't know, Josh, why don't you lead us off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I forgot to mention, of course, there's the issue of whales, right? Whale deaths, dolphin deaths. There's a lot of people who have associated the whale deaths that have been happening along the Jersey Shore and other places with offshore wind development. So if you could address that as well.
Sure. Yeah. My thinking in this is that we have an opportunity to do this right. And a lot of people have different definitions of what right is, but in my definition, it's do it in a way that does account for the environmental aspects of a project, the ecological aspects of a project, to incorporate the latest science and understanding of the different complexities of the ocean and the ecology into the decision making. Can we design a turbine structure that promotes biodiversity or some ecological benefit? Can we use materials and supplies that are environmentally friendly based on different definitions, right? Can we properly assess changes that we're seeing in the ocean environment to projects that may or may not be related to that change, right? So when we think about the whales and the press and media coverage that we got, particularly last year, right? There was not an acknowledgement in some of the reporting that I saw of the fact that the ocean is changing all the time, and it's very difficult to say just because two things happen at the same time, one caused the other or the other was caused by the other, right? And so we can bring in the science, and we're responsible to the evidence that the science brings, and I see a responsibility of the community that I represent to communicate that out so that people can incorporate that. But we have to be sure that when we're evaluating a project, that we do it in a way that is informed by the science, that understands that there are some complexities out there, but we understand a lot of the complexities. There are many things that are causing changes to distribution of marine mammals in the waters off of the mid-Atlantic. These are factors that are related to longer-term change of climate and movements of different prey species. There's changes in just the population size that have happened over time. And the ocean environment, as I've mentioned, is changing. We're seeing changes in temperature and salinity. And so how can we incorporate those things in understanding what impacts are there so that we can mitigate in a proper way for effects that we might see on the environment or the ecology? And so I think there's a real opportunity here. And with collaboration, as Tricia mentioned, it's hard to manage it, but there are opportunities to get all the experts in a space to have those conversations so that we can do it right.
Okay. And Tricia, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Well, first, I agree with Josh. I think that all makes a lot of sense. And I think, we have a tough time maybe talking about this, but it's important to remember why we're doing this. Climate change is a real threat. It is among the leading cause of global biodiversity loss. It's impacting food systems, water systems, the marine environment at a rate that is creating significant threat to people and nature. We have been killing. Before I focused on offshore wind, I did a lot of Clean Air Act litigation for the state. We have been killing people with fossil fuels for a long time. We have been contributing to this climate catastrophe for a long time. So here we are. And we have to prioritize shutting down carbon sources and making clean energy. And as we do that, we have to use best available data to avoid impacts to people, to users, to nature. We have to design systems that meaningfully mitigate and compensate for losses that this prioritization is going to cause. We have to set ourselves up to learn as we go and adapt and improve, always trying to improve outcomes for communities, outcomes for the regulatory approach that we're using, and for nature. We are getting better at this. We've seen the federal government change the way that it's doing its approach for wind energy area selection. It's using a much more robust suitability modeling approach now. It's using best available data. And we are seeing regulatory incentives that are being folded into the way we do the auction for leasing and even through the state procurement processes. So, for example, BOEM has been designing its auctions to give cash value up to 25% of an overall bid to bids that include investment in fisheries compensation, workforce development, supply chain. And recently, in the proposed sale notice for the Central Atlantic, BOEM asked for the first time for feedback on creating a conservation-related bidding credit that would provide a cash benefit, a cash value to the bidder for contributing to environmental mitigation, eco-regional research. They're asking for feedback now on how to structure a bidding credit like that. The Netherlands and Europe has been doing this for quite some time, but there are ways that we can fold in our considerations, our priorities for nature and for people into the regulatory and market incentives.
So, yeah, it sounds like it's interesting what that phrase, you're learning as you're going, right? But that doesn't mean, I guess what you're saying is we have to keep going because of climate change and because of reducing fossil fuel emissions. And I just wanted to sort of point out, at least from my reporting on the issues, I mean, there's definitely ecological impacts, but in the case of whales, what I've been told is, for the most part, the necropsies have shown ship strikes, not issues with offshore wind. But let's move on. And I want to turn it now to the future and next steps. And where do we go from here? Because we've learned a lot so far. And, Europe and China are currently the global leaders in offshore wind, as you guys know. So why is it so much more successful there than here? I know, Trisha, you mentioned a couple things in terms of regulatory structures, but what are some of the lessons that we can learn from there and apply here? And I'll start with Trisha on the regulatory and policy issues and finance.
Sure. So there are different policies and government interests that are driving offshore wind in Europe. And I think Europe, China, and even the US now, again, that we're back on the Paris Climate Treaty, are motivated by obligations under the Paris Climate Treaty. Europe is also worried about energy security, which is a heightened consideration given what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And they've also been very focused on the economic advantages that are coming from being a major part of the offshore wind supply chain. So in addition to climate change, they are kind of really focused on becoming a central player in the build out of the global supply chain for offshore wind. Europe's goal, interestingly enough, is 300 gigawatts by 2050, as compared to the US goal of 110 gigawatts by 2050. So significantly larger. They also have a number of European that come out of like the European Union, a number of policies that really motivate developers to build in considerations for nature and communities into their projects and their bids at the outset. So there is an EU corporate sustainability directive that will require and is requiring a lot of accountability and for companies who are reporting on sustainability that will be audited. So they really have to design for themselves metrics and be able to measure and report out in a meaningful way how they are sustainable and how they are contributing to that. And we know, for example, the North Sea, the ecology of the North Sea was really changed by fishing over time. It was hard bottom, it's now sandy bottom. So the governments around the North Sea are really interested, Josh touched on this a little bit, really interested in using the deployment of offshore wind to bring back some of the hardened habitat in the North Sea. So building out oyster farms, contributing to food production. So a lot of like cross-sector collaboration. And because they're really interested in that, they 50% of their overall bid in the Netherlands, 50% is related to price and other things. And the other 50% is scored on demonstration of ecological benefit, contribution to the enhancement of the marine ecosystem in the North Sea. And what has resulted from that is really kind of like a beauty contest of sorts, where projects are being qualitatively evaluated on what they can deliver in that North Sea environment better than another project. So we are kind of learning from that and taking pieces of that we can fold into the way we do our approach to offshore wind in the United States, but I'd say we're slower in that space. I don't think we mentioned biodiversity or sustainability in any regulatory scheme in the United States, but it's all over the laws and the statutes. There are biodiversity metrics and marine net gain approaches that are taking place in Europe. So I think we can learn from that.
Okay. And just real quick, Josh, do you have anything to say of because we'll have to move on to the Q&A section soon, but do you have anything to add to that in terms of, can you learn anything from the offshore wind development in places like the North Sea, or is the Atlantic coast just so different from that environment?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely things we can learn because they've had offshore wind facilities up for 20 years in many places. And so there are things we can learn about when we think about the oceanographic and ecological impacts. But many of those things don't translate to the waters off the East Coast, where some of the initial projects are planned here in the US. So, for example, the oceanography is different in some places. There are some similarities, but we tend to see larger signals in terms of how the ocean warms from summer to winter, or from winter to summer, and vice versa. Tides tend to be a bit stronger in some of the places in Europe. And so these things matter. For example, there's no baleen whales in the North Sea areas that have been developed. So when we start to think about the interactions of animals with the sites, and so I think there is a lot we can learn. And the good news is there is a lot of expertise on those site-specific processes that happen in the US. And so in many cases, we can do a translation of those results to this. In some cases, we do need more data, but there is a lot we can learn from the experience in Europe. But
Okay.
it doesn't immediately translate.
Gotcha. Okay, we've got so many questions for you guys. So I'm just going to jump in. Here's a question about climate change. maritime storms and hurricanes are becoming more intense and sea swells are becoming larger. Are turbines currently robust enough to withstand this? So I don't know if either of you can answer that question.
I have a
Go
couple
ahead.
of anecdotal things I can share, but I
Okay.
don't know if Josh wants to jump in first.
Go ahead, Trisha, you can start.
So I had the great honor of going to visit a blade testing facility in Boston. It's a really phenomenal thing. If you can arrange a tour of it, I highly recommend it. But they take these blades in this large warehouse and they test them up to category 5 storms. Sometimes they're asked by the developer to test them until they break so that they know what the breaking point is. They share a lot of information about how these blades are designed to withstand that. I also came back from a recent trip where I went to see the High Winds floating wind farm in the North Sea. It was a lot different than going out to Block Island. They gave man overboard instructions. I think the North Sea is a very rough environment, but they are, they have been doing construction there, and these facilities are sustaining. So I think the technology is obviously, like with all the other things we've talked about, evolving, but it seems to me that they're going through the strains of making sure that this stuff doesn't fall down and break.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only thing I would add is that, we have a lot of data on what the differences are in the wind fields and the wind resource in places where wind farms have been installed and places where they're planned. And those types of data sets are really important so that the engineers can account for that and can test for that. And so we do see a difference in North Sea winds versus what you might get on the East Coast, where we might have more sustained, stronger winds in the North Sea with some of these, coastal storms and larger storms that you have, but they may not get the extremes of a Cat 5, right? So as Tricia said, testing for those, but also having a blade that's efficient in the, more moderate winds that we would expect for a more significant amount of time. So all of those are factored into the design.
Gotcha.
They
Floating
apparently
versus
use,
sorry.
oh, sorry, I was just going to say they apparently use like balsam wood in the blades, which I guess is one of the strongest but most flexible types of woods in the world. I didn't realize before I went to that facility, but
Interesting. Floating versus anchored, right? We've been hearing a lot about floating. And of course the current projects, as far as I know, are all anchored. Are there particular issues for floating turbines versus turbine structures that are fixed to the bottom or in shallower waters? And are they viable in the next 30 years? Is the next question. So Trisha,
Well,
go ahead, Josh.
Well,
Yeah.
I can start, and then Trisha's actually seen a facility. I haven't been out to the one in the UK yet, but so they're they're viable because there is a wind farm facility that is floating, that's operating. Equinor has a facility in European waters that's up and running. The floating in the US is targeted for waters that are deeper, right? So the projects that are currently under construction and the ones that are most close to being under construction in the near future are all in water that's shallow enough where it makes sense to have fixed bottom monopiles, right? Or jacket structures like you see behind Trisha, right? These are waters that, and again, that was one of the advantages of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic coast, is that we have a broad shelf. So those shallower waters extend. But when you think about places like California, the Gulf of Maine, those are deeper coastal waters, and you have to move towards a floating structure. And so I don't have any knowledge of the engineering. I know a couple engineers who are, there are many people that are looking at the engineering of these structures. There's a lot of different designs that are out there. But it is a different interaction with the ocean environment. And so when we think about impacts, there will be some differences. There will be things to consider there. But it is a technology that is maturing, and it's already in place in one spot already.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. I would say, I mean, one of the cool things about being up and close next to them is that I expected them to seem like they were floating and they just seemed like they were fixed. I mean, it was like really amazing to see it. They didn't look much different than the ones behind me. So pretty cool technology in terms of the ballast that's used to hold them upright. But there are differences, that we're starting to explore, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of Maine, and in California. The one big difference is that monopile construction is noisy. So you do require like the largest hammer in the world to drill those monopiles into the seabed. The most recent programmatic EIS for the New York Bight, there are over 50 mitigation measures included in that programmatic EIS that are related to mitigation for marine mammals, and half of those are related to the mitigation of noise associated with pile driving and offshore wind construction related activities. So floating would be considered a quiet foundation, like suction buckets or gravity-based foundations. And that does change some of the mitigation, some of the risk and mitigation requirements associated with it. But there are other types of risks that we don't know a lot about. So, are you creating risk for possible secondary or tertiary entanglement with anchor chains? Are there different types of models for floating wind where you don't have to use as many anchor chains to do that? Are you creating habitat? We did see a lot of nesting birds at the Equinor farm using the turbine platforms. So, you kind of create new places, and whether that's good or that's bad, I don't know that we know, but it's certainly something that you need to monitor and you need to try to understand over time. So they will, like Josh said, they're going to bring different types of mitigation requirements and different types of analysis that we have to do to make sure we understand the interactions.
Interesting. Okay. Next question has to do with incentives. With all the requirements and obstacles faced by developers in the US, what is the incentive to bid on a lease? I guess they want to make money, but there's money to be made in energy, right?
Well, I think there's a profit margin, or you wouldn't be moving forward with the project. So
Right.
that's really a business calculation. And if they can get the low cost financing, secure low cost financing, and then secure a reasonable price on the contract, there will be a profit margin. But that's certainly played into the kind of the calculations, the recent calculations and decisions to withdraw and renegotiate contracts. It was really getting to the point where the profit margin wasn't enough to make it worth moving forward with construction of the project. So when those margins are that slim, we really need to start thinking about adding mechanisms that allow for those price readjustments, or create and give different types of financial incentive to move forward with the development.
Fishing.
I've also seen,
Oh, sorry.
Susan, just to say another incentive in the different folks that I've interacted with, there's an incentive to improve the environment, right? And do it in a way that does not impact the environment in a negative way. And so conducting the research, understanding what's going on, so that there is this incentive to have an impact, a positive impact on the planet.
Good point. Good point. There's a question about fishing. Do regulations allow for fishing areas near offshore wind turbines? I know this is a big issue in New Jersey. So I don't know, Josh, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, so
Or
my
either of you?
understanding, Tricia can handle the policy, the regulatory side with much more familiarity and experience than me. But my understanding is that there's nothing that legally limits fishing activities within a wind farm facility in the US, and the Coast Guard has made statements to that. In conversations that I have had with the several members of the fishing industry, there are concerns about the safety, and in certain conditions or given certain gear, There's going to be just safety restrictions. It's not whether it's legal or not to go in, but it's more whether it's safe or not to go in, whether insurance will cover activity within. And so there are questions that the industry is raising in there. And that depends a lot on the gear type that the different fishing industry members are using. It also depends a lot on the actual physical layout of the facility, how far apart the turbines are. And I imagine this is Josh speaking, but I think it will depend a lot on just conditions on a given day. Whether it's a beautiful day like what's behind Trisha there, that may be a different consideration of risk than if you're in a windier or a wavier day, making decisions on that. But that's my understanding.
Right, or
Trisha?
it might preclude night fishing if that's what if that's what you've done. So I think that there have been a range of concerns that have been raised, many of which Josh reviewed, that really need to be taken into consideration. We need to understand, what those impacts are. If commercial and recreational fishers are being displaced, are we adding fishing burden to other places, and upsetting the resource in those places as a result of it? So there are some kind of broader cumulative effects that we need to understand better and consider as well. But I would say that this is also, an opportunity. If you're solution oriented, it's an opportunity to really try to figure out what the investments might look like and the cross-sector collaborations might look like to benefit and help evolve our commercial fishing industries so that they can have state-of-the-art radar technology, better equipment, upgrades to vessels that make it safer so that they don't lose days or they don't lose opportunities to safely pursue their livelihood and what we need for food production. And just whether we can serve a couple of purposes. So if we have a need for, modernizing surveying techniques to get more accurate information that inform quotas, can we use vessels that are already out there? Can we do combined surveying needs between what's taking place with offshore wind and what the needs of the commercial fishing industry are? I don't have answers for this, and I'm not suggesting that that's the right way forward. But I do think that there may be opportunities for cross-sector collaboration that we should explore so we can get to a place where we are coexisting in the most sustainable way possible.
Okay. Next question is about energy storage. Very good question. How do you manage the storage of excess energy produced by offshore wind farms? Unlike coal and gas-fired energy production, which can be varied with demand, ocean energy generation is not demand-driven, and storage is needed to take best advantage of wind energy production. So, Trisha, how about you?
So it's just I lump that in with the overall transmission conversation. We need significant upgrades to our transmission. I think, for example, New England is constrained at connecting approximately 6 gigawatts. We don't have enough outlets to connect more than that at present. So there really need to be some efforts undertaken between the federal government and the states that are regional, interregional, how we're going to move energy between regions, and conversations related to that. And there's a lot of work taking place. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Department of Energy, all looking at that. And battery storage is going to be a big piece of that for some places, as you say, where we need to store that energy for when we need it. So I kind of lump it into that overall conversation, which is a big conversation and a really important question. We probably should have a whole webinar on what we need to do for transmission and battery storage.
Exactly. Okay. Let me move on. Multiple wind farms, and this is always an issue, right? With environmental siting, where our regulatory system doesn't always take into account the impact of more than one industrial facility in an area. So this question is, do you find BOEM's NEPA reviews, that's the National Environmental Policy Act, adequate, especially when BOEM, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, looks at each project individually? How are cumulative impacts from multiple industrial scale wind farms taken into account on I don't know how to say this word, oceanographic processes and existing users like recreational and commercial fishermen? So,
I could speak to
Josh?
the oceanographic. Yeah. So I was fortunate to serve on a committee that National Academies hosted recently on the hydrodynamic impacts of offshore wind facilities in the Nantucket Shoals region. So hydrodynamic is just a fancy word for how the ocean moves and changes. And so one of the things that we considered in that was what's the state of knowledge when we think about what effect a single turbine has, what effect a wind farm of turbines has, and then finally, what's the regional effect, which considers all of the different factors that are going on. And so I think this is an important factor. When we think about the ocean, it's very connected. One of the things that we struggled with when we looked at the literature is there's not a lot of observations on what the effect of a single turbine is. So in order for you to have some idea of the cumulative effect, you need to know what the effect is at the base measure, which is the turbine. And then you think about, well, what happens if you have 80 turbines in an area? And then you think about, well, what if you have multiple projects of 80 turbines in an area? And so if that impact is small at that level and it doesn't extend to the next turbine or it doesn't extend to the next wind farm, then that's a different assessment of cumulative effects than if it does extend those distances. So that's a really complicated and round way of saying that, yes, it's important to consider the cumulative effects. It's also important as you consider those to try and isolate the effect of the wind farm itself or the turbine itself from the effects that are happening at the regional scale that we've already talked about. The changes from if you have 3 nor'easters in October versus 1 nor'easter in October, or if you have a tropical storm that impacts a Nantucket Shoals region one year and not the other, or the effects of climate. And so it's really important as we think of those cumulative effects that we're trying to isolate the cumulative effects of the wind farms and not trying to convolute that with the cumulative effects that happen over that scale from all these other sources of variability.
Yeah, and I can add to, I think for me, the key point from what Josh said is that it's your knowledge base. So one of the things to understand in a regulatory context is that a programmatic environmental impact statement, one that looks up front at the impacts from siting multiple projects or multiple lease areas adjacently, that type of environmental review is only as good as the data that goes into it. And so in a lot of places where we're moving forward with offshore wind, we don't necessarily have complete data until a lessee does site characterization or site surveying work. So we're relying on data portals, we're relying on the bathymetric data and the multi-beam data that we have to understand what's taking place there. But in some instances, there are gaps, there's missing data. So we have to think through the approach. You know, your conclusions are only going to be as good as the information that you put into it. So a couple of things I would point people to as resources and just inspiration of, I guess, of like the progress that we're making is that for the first time ever, BOEM is proceeding with a programmatic approach to the selection of mitigation in the New York Bight. So they aren't doing this approach up front because they need data, as Josh was alluding to, from the developers about how many turbines are you thinking? What types of turbines are you using? What is that layout going to look like? Right. So they're doing the programmatic phase relative to the types of mitigation that might be employed across all 6 adjacent lease areas consistently. And they've put together a robust list of mitigation that they want all 6 of these lease areas to consider as they think about how they design their projects before they submit their construction operation plan. So this is the first time the United States has ever used an approach like this. They're taking comments right now on this document until I think it's March 13th on the approach and on the mitigation. So that's really, I think, promising. And then the other thing I would point folks to is the establishment of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative. That was stood up a number of years ago. They just released their science plan, which looks at potential impacts and potential restoration and mitigation on a regional, eco-regional scale. It is cited or seeded by the environmental nonprofit community, federal government, and industry, who are sharing their information and their opinions about how to move forward with it. And so that science plan was informed by a lot of expert insight, and I would encourage people to take a look at that.
Okay, we've got one more question before the final question. And this is a question about labor. From what you've seen, are shoreline communities more receptive to projects that have implemented community and workforce agreements, i.e. community benefit agreements, host community benefit agreements, project labor agreements, et cetera? Do they have measurable impacts on project support? Trisha, do you want to tackle that?
I think it's segment, right? It's whatever segment of the community got a community benefits agreement. So there's a lot of questions right now about whether there should be, whether there are best practices for negotiating those kinds of agreements, who has a seat at the table, what that process looks like for negotiating a community benefits agreement, and whether what the community asked for is actually in service to the broader community goals and how that's playing out. So there are a lot of, I think, open-ended questions about that. I think it can certainly play a role the same way fisheries compensation can play a role for support, and investment in supply chain and workforce development can play a role for support, play a role in providing support. But I wouldn't want to say that is the pathway to community support, because I don't know how broad-reaching those community benefits agreements are or have been.
I mean, what do you think? How do you think the community objection should be handled? I guess it just depends on what the objection is, but
is this question related to community objection or whether community benefit agreements?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the premise of the question was, do you feel like these kind of agreements mitigate the opposition?
I mean, I suppose in some instances they're designed to kind of mitigate the opposition. I don't think that's what they should be used for. I think community benefits agreements should be used to benefit the community and whatever the priorities of the community are, relative to their own energy transition or workforce development, job training, interest in equity and environmental justice. I think that should be the focus of community benefit agreements. So I have a lot of questions about how they're being negotiated and who are the right voices at that table for the negotiation. I mean, I suppose a company can make whatever deals they want to make to try to alleviate some of the obstacles to support, and that they've probably done that. But I don't think that's the way we should be moving forward with offshore wind in the country. I don't think we should be standing here with our hands out, asking to basically be quiet over concern, over a legitimate concern because we received something in compensation for it. But and I don't think that's the way it's really playing out anyway. But yeah, I guess I have concerns about that type of approach.
Okay. Okay, understandable. Real quick question. There is something about scale. Are offshore wind options only available to big companies and larger utility companies and states? Or is there smaller communities on the shore or even community trusts that have engaged in offshore wind options in order to keep energy costs more affordable for ratepayers? I haven't heard of anything like that, but have you?
I've only seen examples of smaller scale wind for individual homes that's terrestrial based wind, right? You see examples of that. Certainly the sailing community, there are wind turbines that generate power for their boats that you see a lot, but I think there's a inherent cost and engineering capability that's required to put turbines offshore of any size, and that, in my experience, I don't want to speak for the whole industry, but in my experience, I think that has limited it to companies that have those resources in order to be able to put a project like that offshore.
Gotcha. Right. And as a final question to both of you, what is one thing you'd like our audience to take away from today's discussion? And I'll start off with you, Josh.
Well, I hope that you've seen that yes, there are challenges, but there are communities of experts from a wide range of sectors that are collaborating to try and understand the ways to overcome those challenges in a most effective and from my perspective, environmentally conscious way. And I think the big message for me is there's an opportunity to do this right, and I hope that it's science informed. And I don't mean that just because scientists are doing it. I mean the science and the understanding of all these communities. There's an opportunity to deploy offshore wind in a way that sustains fisheries, recognizing the importance of all of the different ocean uses that accounts for the change. But it can only be done if we collaborate in a way that brings all those communities together.
Gotcha. And Tricia?
And I completely agree with what Josh said. I think, we have to be, the takeaway I think I'd like people to have is that we need to build offshore wind at a certain pace and scale to mitigate climate change. We need to take care of our ocean users and our habitat and our environment while we do that. And I think we can do those things. So if we are solution oriented, I believe that we're smart enough and capable enough. We have to get out of a mindset of throwing up problems to delay and into a mindset of bringing answers to challenges. And I think if we switch that mindset, that we can do all of these things in a sustainable way.
Well, thank you guys. I've learned a lot. And I want to hand it back over to Lara from the National Academy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan, for moderating that fantastic conversation. And huge thanks to Josh and Tricia as well. Your insights and contributions were super enlightening. I really want to thank everyone who joined us today. Thanks for your interest and your really excellent questions. We're really sorry we couldn't get through to all of them. This conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same webpage immediately after we end. Another plug for our newsletter, if you haven't already, please sign up to follow all things climate at the academies and be on the lookout for our registration for the March conversation focused on the intersection of gender and climate. If you'd like to share feedback on today's event or ideas for future events, please take our survey. Finally, a big thanks to all the National Academy staff who supported today's event behind the scenes. Special thank you to Kelly Oskvig and Caroline Bell from the Ocean Studies Board for their contributions and suggestions. I finally want to give a huge shout out to Rob Greenway, who has supported every climate conversation since its inception, and he'll be celebrating his retirement from the National Academies tomorrow. Thanks for everything, Rob. The Climate Conversations team will sincerely miss you. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you again next month.